This week's show brought to you by the Lakers. They may be in the lottery, but they can still upset championship teams. Welcome back to another Boxscore Geeks show. I cannot tell you how excited I am about this week's show. We have author of The Alliance, the best-selling, New York Times best-selling book, The Alliance, Chris Ye, longtime friend of the show. Chris, we've been wanting to have you on the show for a while now, and you were busy smoozing it up with Silicon Valley CEOs and other people. And, this is the tail end of your book tour. So I'm glad you finally made it here. Chris, say hey. And I want to hear you give some accolades to your book, The Alliance, and some of what else that's brought you, including the Stanford class you taught as a result.
Thank you so much, Dre. It is always a huge pleasure to be back with the Boxscore Geeks. It's one of the few websites that I visit on a regular basis. I'm always checking it out, even though I mostly lurk, because as a Laker fan, I do not like to post too much. There's too many of us out there already ruining it for the rest of us.
I will say, as a lurker of that, I do notice when I put up a 1980s article about the Lakers and the James Worthy trade, that got you out quick. You were, I think, the third or fourth comment on that article.
Absolutely. Well, the 80s were the golden age for the Lakers. Again, they won other championships, but Magic Johnson, I think, holds a special place in everyone's heart.
All right, so on to your accolades, though. So you wrote a book with your two co-authors, Reid Hoffman, and I'm going to try and get this right. We practiced like 4 times pre-show, but, as we've seen, athletes choke in clutch time. Ben Casnocha. Did I get that right?
That was
Boom.
perfect.
So you wrote this book called The Alliance with, high pedigree co-authors too, that is basically a tech book, a management book. And I read it and it just, appealed so much to me about how this could apply to the NBA. Now, of course, it had much bigger ramifications because, as I mentioned, it's made big splashes in the tech world. You were a New York Times bestseller. And then you also got big names, Eric Schmidt, Marissa Mayer, others, I'm sure, that have come as a result of it.
Yeah, no, and again, we've been very pleased with the reception of the book. The whole point about the book was to help people see that the relationship between employers and employees has really changed. But, the fact is that if you think about it, the relationship we have today is so different than the relationship that, say, you or I saw with our parents when they were growing up. Do you know what the average job tenure is for somebody who's 21 to 30 years old today?
Geez, well, going on my own, it's just under 2 years, and I don't know what you count freelance because that's what I'm at right now. But before freelance, I was averaging just under 2 years a job.
Well, I thought you were a professional gambler. Pardon me, professional daily fantasy sports player.
Among other things, I'm also a freelance software developer. But anyway, continue.
No, but it turns out if you look at the statistics, the average job tenure for someone 21 to 30 these days is 1 year.
Oh, wow. So I was actually like twice the norm.
You're an old timer, so to speak.
Wow. All
also,
right.
I think you're over 30, aren't you, Dre?
I am in my 30s. I've started using, so this is a fun game once you hit 30. Instead of using years, you can start using greats. So the nice part is 32 and 33. That's you're not 32 or 33. You're Magic Johnson and you're Larry Bird.
Ooh, that's true. That's true. And then after that, you end up at Shaq at 34. I think Hakeem was also 34, wasn't he?
Ooh, interesting. I think I'll have to go with the dream because
5. I can't. Who's a good 36? I know there's a couple of 36s.
Well, I'll give myself away. I'll have to look those up in a bit, but not this year. So
fair enough. No, but because people just don't stay on the job that long anymore, the whole notion that we have of the relationship has to change. We can no longer have the situation where everyone pretends that when you join a job, you're going to be there the rest of your life. I often ask people, hey, if you've ever been in a job interview or you've ever conducted a job interview, have you ever heard the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Oh, and yeah, the answer to that is probably based on what you're saying. If you wanted to be a real analytics person and prove your analytics mettle, you would say, well, statistically, I won't be here.
Exactly. But everyone knows that's not the answer you give. So from the very first conversation you have with the company that you're working for, both sides are basically saying, yes, we're going to have to lie here. And that's crazy.
And one reason that really resonated with me was the NBA because, so for instance, we were joking back and forth during the trade deadline where I can't even remember the player that was the specific example, but of course, here's what happens. I go on Twitter, and some beat writer that I'm following says something like Kevin Love is on the trade block. Um, and then, of course, what you find out is then the Cavaliers come forward and say, we would never put Kevin Love on the trade block. And then Kevin Love comes out and says, I'm just here to do my job, and I love my team, and I haven't demanded a trade. The Rockets this offseason were notorious where Dwight Howard was clearly on the trade block. They were saying Dwight Howard wasn't on the trade block. Dwight Howard said he was happy, but him and James Harden are backstage politicking to get one or both of them out of the Rockets. So you're watching this from the outside, and nobody is being honest with each other. And that, like I said, that related so much to just, I think that's your very first example in the book where you bring up the BS notion of calling, a job family, where you can't get fired from a family. And the same kind of idea applies in the NBA, where why are teams upset at LeBron James for leaving in the decision when we all know that that's a crock, that there's not this long-term loyalty?
Exactly. And in fact, LeBron is actually phenomenally underpaid, or has been throughout his entire career, if you consider the value he brings. And it's because the rules of the system prevent him from actually capturing that value. So why shouldn't he be able to choose where he actually wants to work?
Well, also what's fascinating about the NBA in terms of this thing that will keep going down is that the rules of the NBA also make it even worse because, for instance, last year, 2 seasons ago, Brian, you might remember better than me, Drake, the unofficial ambassador to the Toronto Raptors, got in trouble, I think, for tweeting out that Kevin Durant should come play because he was watching Kevin Durant and said, hey, you should consider playing for the Raptors. And the NBA came out and said, according to our rules, if you have an official capacity with a team, you are not allowed to make public statements to players that are under contract. So, for instance, the Mavericks aren't allowed to come out and say, man, we would really like Hassan Whiteside this offseason. Now, they're allowed to do back, if they don't get caught, it's fine, right? If they have their agents or people talking, or they leave cryptic messages, something we really need next season is shot blocking. If Mark Cuban said that, that's a very coded message, but he's not going to get in trouble. But those rules make this weird dishonesty get even worse because teams aren't even allowed to say, yeah, we would absolutely love Kevin Durant, because they might get fined.
Exactly. No, but at its heart, it boils down to people have an outdated notion of what the relationship should be like. And what's interesting to me is that people like Reed Hastings over at Netflix have said, hey, we're like a sports team, not a family. But even in the world of sports, even in the world of the NBA, this dynamic plays out, as we've discussed.
Well, and then sports teams gets into a much more, even if you use that notion, sports is much more interesting than Silicon Valley because in sports, there's restricted free agency or contracts or trade kickers and all this. Whereas as we're all familiar in Silicon Valley, someone comes up with a better job offer, and it's not surprising to see someone who was sitting next to you just disappear because they went and worked at, Netflix or, I don't know. I said Netflix because you were saying Netflix, LinkedIn, Apple, Google, Microsoft. I could just keep rattling them off.
That's right. And again, you look at it, the situation. Now, how many players are there going to be like, and how many employees they're going to be like, who are going to be like Kobe Bryant and spend their entire career at a single team or at a single company? Kobe Bryant's going to spend 20 years with the Lakers. That is an NBA record for most years by a player with a single team. And that's a record that's probably never going to be broken.
Oh, wow. Because, yeah, I mean, even to just hit it, to be in the NBA that long is absurd. And to stick with the team that long is absurd. And to that note, what we're even noticing is the same dishonesty. Both Kobe and the Lakers are trying to sow this story that they were both completely loyal to each other. And, they were meant to be when Kobe was demanding a trade to the Bulls back in the day, and Phil Jackson was jostling to get Kobe Bryant traded early in his tenure. So the idea that these people have been faithful and a family to each other is just a lie. Now, let's actually talk the alliance a bit there, because that's one of your first kind of breakthrough steps, which seems really simple, which is trying to just be honest and transparent with, employees and employers. And doing that is beneficial to both because it lets both of them make a plan for the future instead of this kind of weird trying to second guess what the other person's going to do.
Absolutely. And it boils down to just being honest and saying, hey, what is the reason that we're going to work together? What is the reason I'm going to join this company? What is the reason you're going to employ me? Or what is the reason I'm going to join this team? And what are both sides getting out of it? I think if you think back a couple years to when Steven Jackson was active, I remember he helped the Spurs win a championship and was supposedly in demand. ended up actually having to, he rejected an offer from the Spurs, ended up not being signed by anyone. I think he signed with, I can't remember, with Atlanta or somebody for a short term 1 year contract. And it was explicitly one of these things where both sides knew what they were getting into. They were like, listen, we need you to come in here and play your ass off, but we understand that you're doing this for your next contract, and that's okay. And we're not going to be the ones to give you that next contract.
Oh yeah, and I mean, it would be interesting if more teams did that. And we had four teams that we wanted to kind of discuss, kind of comparing to the Alliance. So let's break this down a little because I know we're going to get into the basketball talk a lot. So the Alliance, you basically have made the notion that the modern employee employer relationship is broken, mostly in regards to tech, but I'm assuming other fields apply. And the
Absolutely.
NBA, absolutely. You kind of suggest a few things. I don't want, go out and buy the book if you haven't. If you're self-employed like myself, by the way, you can expense it. Ask your accountant. But you basically mentioned a few things, which is this idea, the concept of a tour of duty. And I love these two things where instead of viewing it as a family, you view it as,
A
a
sports
team.
family. Yeah.
And then you go one step further, a tour of duty. Instead of just saying, we want you to work for us and do this, you're saying, you're going to work for us and you have a stint that we're going to try and figure out in that period of time. We expect you to do something. We're going to get something out of it. You're going to get something out of it. At the end, we revisit. And that seems like it would easily apply to sports teams. And then finally, this last thing that I really want to ask you about sports teams eventually is this idea of an alumni network. Because I know, based on the relationship you're talking, so many companies that I've left because you were job searching behind their back and you were making new LinkedIn contacts and you left for more money and you don't want to talk to them because they didn't give you the raise you wanted and that's why you found another job. You don't necessarily get the interaction of former people. And that was something huge you brought up, which is in the book, an employee, even if they've left you, can still be an asset if they have a knowledge base that they can give back to the company. So those are kind of the I think I'm hitting the big three things. And obviously there's more in the book.
So let's talk about the tour of duty, because what's important about the tour of duty is it's about what is the nature of that relationship and how are the two parties going to work together. And it's not as simple as a contract. So in the NBA, for example, you might get signed to a 3 year, $30 million contract. That's your contract. But that's not necessarily your tour of duty because it doesn't say what you're being brought in to do. Are you being brought in to rebound and play defense? Are you being brought in to score in the post? Are you being brought in as a 3-and-D defender? That's more your tour of duty, what you're trying to accomplish and what you're ultimately getting out of it. The 3 year, $30 million contract is merely the legal side of the equation. So, for example, let's take an NBA player who is going to sign with someone in the offseason. So I think Hassan Whiteside is a classic example of a guy signed by the Miami Heat. He was undrafted, as I recall.
Oh yeah, he was I don't know if he was undrafted or second round. He was with the Sacramento Kings originally. So it was either late second round or undrafted completely.
So he had a specific contract, and the contract was very favorable to the team, probably close to an NBA minimum. But the idea was, hey, you're going to come in here and you're going to get a chance to play. If he looked around, he would notice there's no other centers on this roster. I guess I'm going to get a chance to actually play and prove my value, which is exactly what he's done. Meanwhile, the Heat have gotten something out of it. They've gotten superstar production or all-star production for very cheap.
Giving you an up. Sorry to cut you off, but giving you an update because I just looked this up today on BoxscoreGeeks.com. He is per minute the best player in the league and per minute the best center in the league right now.
Astonishing. Absolutely.
Actually, let me rephrase that. That is not position adjusted. When you adjust him for position, Steph Curry blows him away.
Steph Curry is on top, as I recall. But I can believe, because of the value of centers, that he is the most valuable in terms of wins produced. But that's an example of how the tour of duty is actually different from the contract. And by the way, Hassan Whiteside, his tour of duty is not all about how much he scores, although it's important that he does some of that. It's about that rebounding and shot blocking. It's about being able to provide those characteristics to the team.
Well, so what I liked is, and I got my notes in front of me. So you listed three in the book, and I don't want to just reread the book, but basically you I'm actually going to use my own terms. So basically you have a rotational tour of duty, which I would call like NBA journeyman. Yep. You have a transformational one, which I would call like franchise player. And you have foundational, which in the NBA, I don't know how much that would apply, but I could maybe see it applying to, say, someone like Tim Duncan.
Well, exactly. There are a few rare cases where somebody actually is foundational. I think the Spurs and Tim Duncan are a great example. Tim Duncan, he is going to. It depends. Maybe he'll be able to play for. I think he came into the league a year or two after Kobe. If he stays for two or maybe three more years after Kobe retires, he may actually have that record. I don't know if he's going to be willing to play another 3 years. He's still highly effective, but Tim Duncan may just be getting tired of having to get up and travel all the time and do all the work. He may say, you know what? It's time to hang it up.
Yeah, but and so going back to tour of duty, what I really like is it's basically a timed period, usually duration based, where you say in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, in the next 2 years, here is what we are expecting you to do. Now, in the tech world, this can get easier because it can be a project, or you're going to be on call, or you're going to be learning this, or you're going to be shadowing that. But in the NBA, it actually what you brought up was really fascinating because you were saying you're brought in to rebound, you're brought in to do this. What I think gets really interesting, and one of the teams I want to discuss is the Lakers, is it becomes very apparent that these players know their contract, but don't know the role that they're expected for. And this disconnect, I think, is actually hugely problematic. So the Lakers, for example, have D'Angelo Russell, who I'm going to give you some optimism as a Lakers fan. He was terrible to start the season,
Yes.
and I was looking at his numbers today, and he's actually like an average rookie now. But the key note of that is if he started terrible and he's an average rookie now, that means he's shown major growth. And I was looking over his numbers. He's been playing quite well. But so he was brought in. A tour of duty for him might be to say, look, we're gonna ramp you up slowly. We don't expect a lot out of you. We expect you to pick up these things, and we expect you to, by the end of probably 1 or 2 years, be in the starting shooting guard role. And from some of Byron Scott's comments, that is what they expect. It's very apparent listening to D'Angelo Russell in press conferences and reading things. None of that has been communicated to him.
That's right. And again, this is a key flaw in the system. The Lakers have this guy, D'Angelo Russell, and they have contractual control of him for the next 4 years. But just
And
having
yeah,
contractual control is not enough. If he decides that he doesn't want to be there anymore, then they've totally failed. And I agree with you, by the way. I mean, I've watched him play this entire season. It's clear he has a lot of potential. And best of all, it's not just based on the eye test. You can see he has potential by the way he's performed over the past month or two. But the key is, are they having that communication? Are they being open and honest? And it's very clear that his relationship with Byron Scott is not good. I think it's pretty clear that the relationship of most of the players with Byron Scott is not good. And that's a big issue because if you don't have a good relationship with your manager, if you don't have an open and honest relationship, then, guess what? If that manager is still around in a couple of years, I wouldn't expect D'Angelo Russell to be around. Now, that being said, I think the Lakers pretty much have Byron Scott here to help Kobe ride off into the sunset, and then he'll be relieved of his duties and off to being an NBA analyst again.
I think one problem with the NBA, and we've discussed this a ton, is both tanking and then what we were already talking about earlier in the show, where there are certain things you're not allowed to explicitly say. So Byron Scott is not allowed to go, into the media and say, "Hey, look, we very clearly want to lose games because we have a high draft pick. We don't want to lose." He can't say that, and then what gets awkward is he can't necessarily tell his employees, his players, and so
Correct.
the NBA contributes a lot to the problems that, in tech are synthetic. In tech, there's no reason for a manager to lie to an employee other than kind of, in the alliance, you kind of bring us up where it's this fake optimism where you think if I don't tell my employee, hey, your job might not be around in 2 years, or hey, you're only here to do this, they won't notice. Whereas I'm trying to remember, it's Freakonomics or Dan Ariely, or I've read too many books, Chris.
Mm.
I need a
A
better
good problem to
index.
have.
And say again.
A good problem to have.
Oh yeah, but there was one where there was an issue where they were asking employees during like a company in crisis, if the employees knew, and they were basically like, "Yeah, we know, but no one's telling us the truth, and that actually makes us more worried." So, the NBA kind of breeds some of these problems, but it is one of those issues where, for D'Angelo Russell or other young players, if you can just be honest with them and say, look, we don't actually need you this season. And I think one team that's really good at this, another team we said we were going to discuss, is the Spurs, where it seems very evident that they, with a lot of their young players, they are very upfront and say, we are not expecting an immediate impact out of you. We just want you to get up to speed.
Right. And this is one of the most important things about the alliance, which says that The real thing that employees are looking for is career development. And that's precisely what the Spurs do. They bring in their players, they give them room, but they focus so much on player development. Think of a guy like Kawhi Leonard. They they got Kawhi Leonard on that draft day trade. They actually traded away George Hill, one of Greg Popovich's favorite players, in order to get the draft pick and to take Kawhi. And when Kawhi came into the league, he couldn't shoot. Most people don't remember that, but he couldn't shoot.
Oh, I have to. You're going to sideline me because now I have to look this up. But yeah, keep going, Chris.
So what happened was the Spurs actually went ahead. They had coaches. They broke down and said, we're going to completely change your shooting form. We want you to start from scratch. Don't worry about making shots. You're going to have value for us regardless. But the long-term future is we want you to be a good shooter as well. We want to remake your jump shot as a result. And they brought him along slowly. He was a complimentary player. Now he's one of the best players in the league. He's clearly the leader of the team. And by the way, he's shooting great from long range as well.
And I think his shooting was pretty decent to start. But yeah, if you just notice the ramp up, when he started in the league, he was only taking 12.6 shots per 48 minutes. And now he's at 21.8. So yeah, that kind of ramp up. And I think a lot of teams could benefit from that kind of idea. And then also, I think in your book, you've got the transformational one. I think one actual funny issue with the NBA is a lot of players just assume that they're the franchise player and not enough know. And actually, I'd be curious on your opinion here, both in tech where you have a lot of big egos and in sports where you have a lot of big egos. How do you handle someone that is essentially on a rotational tour of duty? We're only expecting you here for a couple of years. We're not expecting anything long term. We're going to help you develop, but you're not the future. How do you think NBA teams should deal with that? Because there've got to be tons of NBA players that think I'm the future of this franchise, and the reality is you're here for 2 years because your contract's good.
Right, and every player got to the NBA because they were a superstar in high school and a superstar in college, and everyone around them was telling them how amazing they were. I don't know if you know this, but Trevor Ariza was coming up in high school the same year as LeBron James. And I remember reading an article somewhere. Trevor Ariza's mom was telling him, "You're better than LeBron James. Why do you pay so much attention to LeBron James?" And Trevor Ariza was a highly touted recruit at UCLA, and he only played there for a year before ending up in the NBA. But the point is that everyone's telling you how amazing you are. Well, you know what? A team like the Spurs does a good job of this. They pick the players, and they pick players who understand and who are self-aware enough to know mostly who they are. Stephen Jackson was an interesting experiment in the contrast, and you'll note they really haven't done a lot of that since then. But the players understand who they are, they're relatively humble, willing to come in on the terms that they're brought in, and understand that ultimately the Spurs way makes them a lot more valuable.
Well, yeah, I mean, one interesting example is, how am I dropping his name? He plays for the Hawks right now, Tiago Splitter.
Yes.
So Tiago Splitter on most teams would be an example of a failed player where, he would probably have bad blood or whatever. Unless I'm mistaken, I haven't read anything to the contrary. From Tiago Splitter's perspective, everything ended up great for him, and he ended up in a better situation because they essentially, they brought him up slowly. They didn't overhype him. They got him to a good contract, a very reasonable one. When they traded him to a team where his role on that team was good. And, I think he would probably understand if they said, look, we're going to pick up LaMarcus Aldridge. And if we pick up LaMarcus Aldridge, well, first off, we need to get rid of you to pick up LaMarcus Aldridge. But even if we didn't have to get rid of you to pick up LaMarcus Aldridge, if you, Tim Duncan, and LaMarcus Aldridge are on this team, there's a very obvious odd man out. So Would you rather go to another good team? The Hawks were a good team and be a key player there, or would you rather stick around here? So there's so many players in the Spurs that I could buy coming back to them later or trading back or having no ill wills. Whereas, look at the reign of, he was on the Lakers, but look at Shaq's entire history.
Yes.
And imagine how many teams would trade to get him back, barring, I think the Lakers, I don't recall if they did this, but I know it's a common thing, right? Where you sign the player after they've retired just so you have them on the team as they retired or something. And I don't think the Lakers did that, but if they did, I wouldn't be surprised.
They didn't, but it is something where I think that they're going to put a statue of Shaq outside Staples Center. He brought the team 3 championships. Everyone knows he was more responsible for those 3 championships than Kobe. But, the fact remains, I agree with your assessment of the Spurs. I mean, you have a situation where sometimes, the company is going to move on. Sometimes the employee is going to move on. but it's possible to negotiate that process in a way that leaves both sides feeling positively disposed towards each other. Splitter is a great example. Like you said, they said, listen, Tiago, we're going to have to break the alliance in the sense of, you're no longer going to have a role here, but let's figure out how to get you into the right situation, the best possible situation for you. And I don't think it was the case where they're like, hey, congratulations, you're going to Atlanta. I imagine they had conversations along the way and said, hey, just FYI, this could happen. We're thinking about bringing in LaMarcus Aldridge. If we do, as you pointed out, you and Tim and LaMarcus, who's not going to play? It's probably you. Let's try to bear with us through this process, and let's try to find a good home for you. And I think that, again, you end up in a situation where there isn't that bad blood, where people are perfectly happy with the ultimate outcome. And again, Tiago Splitter is a guy who's won a championship with the Spurs. I think he's pretty happy with his life.
Yeah, and what I would say, I'm curious about the alumni network, actually not NBA related at all, because I know that's something that you've presented and you've had lots of people interact. How much fostering of that you've seen? Because I've been at a few big tech companies, and obviously there wasn't really an alumni network around when I was there. There were some mailing lists where they'd mail you stuff after the fact, and that's always nice. But I'm curious how that's been fostered, because one of your big points in the book is, and I don't know how much this applies to the NBA, but just in tech, the knowledge base that a person has is just huge. You're going to be limited as to what you can know. The connections that a person has are huge. Everybody knows this. Everybody says networking is a big deal. So it just seems a waste to lose an employee for nothing, especially over bad blood, right? If you're upset with them for, doing a LeBron James decision, getting a better job and leaving, how much fostering of that, and how in companies you've dealt with, how much interaction with the alumni networks have you seen? Because that was one of the most fascinating parts to me. But of course, when I read the book, I'd been out of big tech firms for a couple of years at that point, and so it didn't apply as much.
Most companies still do a terrible job of this. Unfortunate, but true. I think that we are seeing some companies say, hey, I'm curious about this. Can you help us figure this out? Which is great. But most companies still do a terrible job. And it's unfortunate because there's so much potential value. And I think if you look at alumni networks in the NBA, again, let us turn to our favorite team, or so it seems, the Spurs, who do a fantastic job of this. I remember reading an article where somebody was talking with Avery Johnson. He said, oh, I got to go. I'm going to a Spurs dinner tonight.
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh, really? Now, Avery Johnson, of course, played for the Spurs, helped them win 2 championships back in the David Robinson era. And he's been retired for 15, 16 years. He coached several other teams. He has no formal affiliation with the Spurs. But when the Spurs are in town, they have team dinners. They gather together all the former players and coaches.
By the way, what should be noted about that is what Avery Johnson, am I mistaken, did he coach the Mavericks?
He did.
He did.
If he coached the Mavericks and is still friends with on friendly terms with the Spurs, that's huge, because the Spurs-Mavericks rivalry in Texas, I didn't realize this until I visited some family in Texas. That is a big deal in Texas, so that's impressive.
Yeah, no, and again, Avery Johnson is just one random example. I think that Steve Kerr, for example, still participates in some of these dinners. And what's amazing about this is, one of the points I try to make to corporate audiences, I say, do you understand your employer brand? Do you understand your talent brand? And they say, yeah, we have these values and we have these missions. I'm like, no, that's not what creates your brand. What creates your brand are your former employees and your current employees, in that order. Because when someone is thinking about working for a company, guess what? They're probably not going to work for the company that long. So the most important thing is, what kind of boost is that company going to give to their career? And the best way to determine that is to look at former employees or former players. And it's clear by looking at the Spurs that playing for the Spurs boosts people's careers. Danny Green, cut on the scrap heap. The Spurs rehabilitate him, turn him into a valuable player. The same is true for so many other people. Boris Diaw, fat, laughingstock, on his way out of the league, brought back to the Spurs, and somehow still contributing despite looking like he's eaten, he's twice the size he was when he came into the league. So the Spurs do this. And what's amazing about it is, you think about, here you're in a locker room. What do you think happens in the locker room when somebody talks to somebody like Tiago Splitter or George Hill about playing for the Spurs? He's like, oh man, those were great days. I love being together with those guys. I still get together with them. Hey, I'm having dinner with them when they're coming into town. Do you think players hear that and say, oh, now, you know what? That sounds kind of cool. I want to play for that team. That seems like the kind of organization I want to be a part of. Of Of course they do. It has huge value, and yet most teams do nothing about this. God only knows what the Knicks do.
Yeah, I mean, other teams, it just gets funny when you look at, say, the Magic and the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are baffling to me, and it's very clear that people just follow LeBron James around.
Right.
That Comic Sans debacle. It's like you see that happen, and you go, who would ever want to play for you willingly?
Well, the answer is if there's enough money, people are willing to play. But I think it's very clear the Spurs have consistently been able to get players to take less money to play in their system. LaMarcus Aldridge took less money, correct?
I think LaMarcus Aldridge, I mean, I think he got about as close to it as possible, but he basically did give them kind of like a friends and family discount, which isn't huge, it's like 5% or something. But yeah, Tim Duncan's been giving them a huge discount for years. I think Manu Ginobili it was probably a wise decision for his part because I think he passed up on probably one really big payday, but then they've kept him around longer than other teams would. I'm trying to think of many players that, I think another interesting aspect of the Spurs in that regard is they kind of understand the tour of duty and they kind of set the contracts the same way. And I think that's a big disparity in the NBA the other way, which is you have these contracts that are for 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, and teams hand them out because they have to be competitive. And they don't have a 3-year plan for that player. They have a 1-year plan, or they have a 5-year plan. So they hand out a 3-year contract to LeBron James. Year 3 comes around. LeBron James says, I want to go to Miami. And they go, what are you doing? We had a 5-year plan. And you go, well, that wasn't really lined up. That wasn't really conveyed to me. I signed a 3-year contract. So I think the Spurs actually do a fairly good job of lining up contracts with plans, which is a remarkable thing to do. And I think Brian and I, we harp on this every week about the number of teams that just, hand out contracts and don't think about the ramification of that contract. Our favorite example is Kendrick Perkins on the Oklahoma City Thunder and how it cost him James Harden.
Yeah, exactly. How'd that trade work out for the Thunder?
It was so close. And I mean, they should have just spent the extra money, but that gets into another weird question about other things.
Absolutely. But
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but I think that, the 4 teams that we talked about, at least you brought up before the podcast, were the Spurs, whom we've talked about a lot. But then there's also the Warriors and the Lakers and the Rockets. And I think that it's a fascinating study in sort of very different approaches to team building. And it's not a surprise in many ways, I think, that the Spurs have done so well for so long. So I think that the interesting thing about the Warriors is that this regime of the Warriors is very different than the previous regimes. Like the Spurs, they take a long-term view. Like the Spurs, they bring in players on a true tour of duty, right? They give people something where they're a much better fit. Bringing in Andrew Bogut, that was a trade which, amazingly enough, quite a number of dumb Warriors fans opposed. They're like, "Oh my God, we're trading Monte for Andrew Bogut." I'm like, "You guys have no idea."
Chris Cohan got booed for that trade.
Yeah, I wrote an article about that, about when they were getting booed, when Lacob was getting, or Lacob, I think is how you say it.
Lacob. But it's astonishing. Monte was horrible. I mean, Monte has never been the same since he had that motorcycle accident. He actually was good before the accident.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't want to throw shade or anything at him because he was quite productive, and then he had the off-court issues where basically he just injured himself and then was never the same after.
Exactly. No, before that he was like, again, if you have a scoring guard and he shoots 53% from the field and scores efficiently, that's still very valuable. It's just that after the accident, he became a scoring guard who shot 42% from the field. That's not quite as useful. But Bogut comes in on a very clear tour of duty, very clear role. Andre Iguodala comes in, very clear role. Klay Thompson, even though he's not my favorite player, I don't think that good, but he has a very clear role on the team, and he helps the team be more than the sum of its parts because of what he provides.
Yeah, that was one interesting part. Oh, interesting. Klay Thompson has dropped below, although to be fair, for this season, Klay Thompson has kind of dropped in production, but I think he has had injuries and hasn't been the same. And we're saying the same thing about Monte Ellis, which is when your entire game is shooting and shooting efficiently, and then you come back and don't shoot quite as well. Actually, I'm gonna have to look at this actually, Chris, because his shooting efficiency is pretty much spot on with last year. He's got to be making other mistakes, so I'll look that up in the downtime.
But the value that he brings, everyone knows, is that with him and Curry on the court, it just destroys a traditional NBA defense. you're completely NBA defenses that don't know what to do against the Warriors because you have Steph Curry, whom you have to pick up as soon as you get across half court, and you have Klay Thompson, who's deadly on catch and shoot threes, and it just destroys any concept of a normal defense.
Let me ask, what did the Lakers do? Because the Lakers took apart the Splash Brothers. I
Yes.
think I think Curry and Clay went like 3 for 20 or something at one point that game.
Yeah, to be precise, they went 1 for 18 from 3-point range. Steph Curry went 1 for 10, and Klay Thompson went 0 for 8 through the bagel.
Jeez.
So what the Lakers did was pretty, again, simple to say, harder to execute. So they blitzed like crazy on those guys. So in the pick and rolls, it was every pick and roll was show both players above the 3-point line. Do not allow them to get a clear shot. Be willing to give up people going to the basket. And just trust that your bigs can recover quickly enough. Now, part of it is in this Lakers game, the bigs that they're playing out there, they didn't play Roy Hibbert that much. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I think that the Lakers didn't do as well when Roy Hibbert was on the floor. Because the Warriors don't run out there with a conventional center-led lineup anyways. Bogut is not an offensive threat, so having a defensive center out there is not really that big a deal. So for most of the game, they ran with either Julius Randle or Brandon Bass or Larry Nance Jr. as the big who is hedging on the pick and rolls on those 3-point plays that the Warriors like to run. All three of those guys are extremely mobile. They're not particularly great shot blockers. They're not particularly big, but they're very mobile and they're able to recover quickly and prevent the Warriors from really making them pay for blitzing on those pick and rolls up at the top of the 3-point line.
And then, of course, the Warriors, they basically pulled a repeat of the finals against the Cavaliers, which is if the Warriors are going to have their worst shooting performance ever, then they're going to lose. And, I think I've heard some theories that maybe Los Angeles, the nightlife and expecting an easy game might have contributed to that. But regardless.
Yeah,
So,
but again, not give the Lakers credit. They played hard. There are a lot of other teams that got up on the Warriors that led the Warriors in the fourth quarter. Most of those teams ended up going home and losing as well, and this Lakers team managed to close it out.
But then back to the Warriors, what makes it interesting to your point there, and I think Steve Kerr deserves a lot of credit with this because it was different under Mark Jackson and what we were discussing earlier, where players expect to be a transitional. They're going to be the franchise player, and you have to look at someone and say, you're not the franchise player. The Warriors, at least the last 2 seasons, all of the players seem to understand what their role on the team is. And it has to help that for most of those players, they're young and have decent contracts. So they don't like that. That's another issue, right? If you're a player in a contract year, even if I tell you your role is to do this and you're going to be doing it for 3 years when we finally make it to the finals, well, if I have a 1-year deal and I can look at the salary cap and I go ask Larry Kuhn and he says they can't afford to keep you, then why am I going to want to be the defensive rebounding big when I know that contract year that's going to hit my offseason value? But the Warriors, because everybody that's young is on a long-term deal, because all of the veterans have bought in, Andrew Bogut, Andre Iguodala want to be there. It seems like they're in an ideal spot with everybody knowing their role and being in a fine contract situation to not worry about it.
And by the way, fascinating point there, which you mentioned in passing. The Warriors made the playoffs under Mark Jackson. They won more games under Mark Jackson at any time since the Run TMC era with Tim Hardaway, Mitch Richmond, and Chris Mullin, which was over 20 years. So he was their most successful coach in 20 years. And they fired him and brought in Steve Kerr, which is amazingly bold move for a franchise to take. Because even though, statistically speaking, you might be able to say, well, we need someone who plays by advanced metrics as opposed to by traditional gut and whatnot. And Mark Jackson, again, more of a traditionalist than a new school guy. The players loved playing for him. Steph Curry was very upset that they fired Mark Jackson.
He did get into some disputes, if I recall, with both David Lee and Andrew Bogut, which was interesting.
Yes. Oh, yes. And again, not all the players loved Mark Jackson, but Steph Curry, the most important player, spoke up in favor of Mark Jackson and protested when he was fired. But Steve Kerr came in and did a fantastic job of building an even stronger relationship with his players. And instead of Mark Jackson's relationship, which was a family-style relationship, hey, we're all in this together, it's us against management, Steve Kerr built a relationship that was around, hey, let me explain, you're a grown man, even though you're young, let me explain why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And let me explain where we're going to go with this. And that's how somebody like, David Lee, for example, ends up being injured, ends up, losing his job to Draymond Green, but ends up playing a very critical role in the NBA Finals. And again, a guy who had a very amicable relationship with the team, even though he was ultimately shelved and traded away.
Well, and I think from his part, what makes it interesting to me is Brian and I talked this back when that happened. I think it was probably best for him in terms of getting traded. Now, it does kind of hurt that the Celtics ended up having a plethora of young bigs that have just gone off.
Yeah.
But, it was actually best for David Lee, I would argue, with Draymond Green coming up to be traded. And it's like, you got your ring, you got paid. Why don't you go to a team that could use you for the season and actually help you get a contract next season?
And they traded David Lee as a favor to David Lee as well. Right? They could have kept him around as insurance, but they said, you know what, we're going to trade you, David. He wanted to be traded. It was a mutual decision on the part of the team and the player. So well, I think was another great example of even in the dissolution of the employment relationship, they were actually allies and working together.
Well, I think the salary cap made it interesting, where I think just his cap hit because of weirdness was huge too. But I mean, to that point, I think Brian, when David Lee was waived by Boston, actually made a joke. He said they should re-sign David Lee, and I think Brian was saying
they can't under
that,
the rules of the CBA, however.
Yep.
So he went to
Yep.
Dallas.
Oh, okay. So I was going to say, you were saying that non-ironically though, and that's the key point, is you can ask yourself a question about a player. And so, for instance, Marcus Camby, player near and dear to my heart, loved him on the Nuggets, one of the best, most productive bigs in NBA history.
Absolutely.
And it's obvious he's never coming back to the Nuggets. Like, as soon as they traded him for a second-round pick and to shelve cap, and did that after a winning season where I think he won Defensive Player of the Year, basically the way they handled him guaranteed we'd never get him back, and that's not what you want. And one thing we try and avoid on the show is giving too much credit to teams for doing like everything right, because things can turn on a dime, right? It's really easy for a team to just do everything right for a season. This might actually be a nice transition to the last team that we wanted to talk, Chris. But, teams can do everything right for a season, and then a few minor tweaks and they fall apart. And the Warriors are a great example of this. The Warriors under Lacob seem to have had very smart plan A's. That's how I've described it to Brian. They were going after Nene and Iguodala back in the day, and Dwight Howard, and that was amazing.
And DeAndre Jordan.
And DeAndre Jordan, they're the reason DeAndre Jordan has had his last contract, and then probably helped contribute his current contract. But regardless, they missed on all of their plan A's, and then their plan B was like Kwame Brown, and so it seems like they've had good plans but haven't had good contingency plans. Is my take.
As a side note, I will say this for Kwame Brown. Kwame Brown is a good one-on-one post defender, but he is one of the worst NBA players in history. Oh my God.
Well, he's no Andrea Bargnani or Darko Milicic, but he's up there. And he is actually, like, we come up with weird names and weird awards and something. He has to be one of the few players that's been involved in the most number of high-profile trades while being a horrible player in such trades. Because, of course, Pau Gasol, I think before that it was Caron Butler and Shaq or something. So, I mean, he's bounced around in a bunch of trades that mattered without being a player that matters, which, there's something to that. It is impressive.
Which is definitely true. And a couple of other notes. I mean, with thinking about results, right? When the Lakers traded for Dwight Howard and Steve Nash, it was clearly a short-term move. But, those were moves which I said these moves make sense. Steve Nash was still productive. He looked like he was on a very gradual Tim Duncan-like decline. And Dwight Howard was Dwight Howard. And, those were good moves. If you could get rid of Andrew Bynum and replace Ramon Sessions with Steve Nash, you do it.
Oh, absolutely.
But as it turns out, Steve Nash gets kicked in the shin by Dame Lillard his very first game, and that destroys all the plans. Well, also, and by the way, Dwight Howard is an idiot.
Yeah, Dwight Howard has to be one of the most painful players to me, because he is, this is like Bull Durham. He's totally a Crash Davis player. He's so damn talented, even now. But he just, everything you read about him off the court, about eating 20 candy bars a day and going to strip clubs and all this other stuff, that's one of the juicy bits of gossip on the Rockets in this offseason, is that James Harden was trying to get him kicked off the team. And that's, actually, I'm curious about this. It's a complete tangent, Chris. Audible.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on, like, team cohesion and getting along, Brian actually sent me an article this week about a big Google research project that basically says, turns out being nice is one of the most valuable things for good productivity among team members.
Right.
And the NBA is this place where obviously star players are so valuable that teams are willing to put up with Michael Jordan being a jerk or Charles Barkley being a jerk, or LeBron James, used to notoriously chew out Mario Chalmers kind of needlessly.
Right.
And then in tech, we have this. I think it's a myth. That's my take. I'm you could yell in the comments. I'll probably just ignore it. But I hate the myth of like the 10x developer. I think there's a lot to that I don't buy. But this idea of you have these star people that drive things that you want to keep happy and placate, but at the same time, it kind of hurts cohesion. Where do you fall on that? Like, what's your opinion on NBA teams, tech teams, the jerk person that's really productive versus everybody else on the team hating them?
So I think it's no surprise that I think it's idiotic to cater to a quote unquote star player who's counterproductive to the benefit to the overall goals of the team. I would phrase it this way. I played pickup basketball. You've probably played pickup basketball, right, Dre?
Of course.
So how do you think how do those teams do when you're playing with a couple of guys who are a-holes and don't get along with each other? Do those teams usually win or do they usually lose?
Well, it's the one advantage, and this is like to the NBA point. If they're really, really good, then it's the most frustrating thing in the world because they make threes or they easily drive on everybody and you hate them, but they're not fun. If it's a pickup game that you're hoping to play, they're not fun to play against because, as you mentioned, they're not getting along and they're mad at each other.
Exactly. And again, yes, you know what? It is possible, given the difference between you or I and Michael Jordan, that somebody could be a jerk and yet be so good that it's still the right decision to bring the jerk on board. But, basketball is not baseball. Baseball, you know what? You can have as many jerks as you want because it is not a real team sport. It is fundamentally an individual sport.
Oh, I'll put a link in the notes, Brian, but we may have arguments in this. But continue, Chris.
Well, just take Barry Bonds, for example. Everyone knows Barry Bonds is one of the biggest jerks in the history of sports. But Barry Bonds is a phenomenally productive player. So guess what? If you have Barry Bonds on your team, you're likely to win. The fact that Barry Bonds is a jerk probably doesn't cause whoever's playing first base to hit worse.
Oh, actually, that's a fascinating point to what you said is the key thing that most employees want, and this has to be true in the NBA, and we can define development as whatever you want. But you said employees want development. In baseball, to your point on Barry Bonds, if Barry Bonds is hitting behind me, he has no choice but to hit me in.
That's right.
Barry Bonds is going to get me runs, which help my stat sheet. In the NBA, if I'm playing next to Kyrie Irving, and this is a problem for Kevin Love that we bring up a lot, Kyrie Irving directly impacts Kevin Love's livelihood, his ability to progress as a player, his ability to progress as, an all-time great, all of these things. So to your point in basketball and even in tech, if the person hinders other people's development, then it can be hugely problematic.
Exactly. And one of the things that, we're going to talk about a lot in the upcoming book on scaling up companies.
Oh, fascinating. Have you leaked this already?
Yeah. So is the importance of corporate culture. And one of the important things about your corporate culture is the way you can tell that you actually have a corporate culture is if there are certain extremely talented people that you refuse to hire.
And from just my personal experience in tech, where, I've mentioned there have been a couple jobs I've had that I've really loved and a couple I have, I think a mature adult thing to kind of admit, and we've talked the Spurs up and the Warriors, Brian and I have gone back and forth on the Kevin Love for Klay Thompson trade on being a good fit. And, it is worth noting that it's acceptable for a talented person and a talented team to just not be right for each other. That seems very adult because, we've seen plenty of good couples where we like both people in the relationship that break up, and they have a good reason for they're not breaking up because one of them's horrible. Right. They just don't work together. And I think to your point there, and NBA teams as well, it's a very mature adult thing to say, you're a good player, we're a good team, but we don't work together.
Exactly. There just isn't a fit. By the way, the main reason there isn't a fit for Kevin Love and the Warriors it's not Kevin Love's fault. It's just that Draymond Green produces nearly as much as Kevin Love would, actually more than Kevin Love recently, and shows up more strongly on the defensive end, enables the Warriors to do the kinds of things on defense that, by the way, everyone thinks of the Warriors as an offensive team. They're actually even better as a defensive team.
Oh, they are. I mean, the Warriors are, lost to the Lakers aside, I just go over these stats over and over again. And Jeremy Britton, friend of the show, and then of course Brian Foster, our producer, who's Brian. You've been nice and quiet. I really appreciate Brian. One of the things that makes him an amazing producer, he's willing to share the ball. If you're not here, Chris, Brian brings up his game, talks a ton. If a guest is here, Brian is willing to just go there for the link. So Brian, I didn't think of a shout out for the show. So Brian, you're my shout out because you are an amazing producer. But anyway, I just talk to Warriors fans and I'm like, people are just not as excited as they should be because they get that this team is good, but they don't get how good. And I keep saying that over and over and over again. And it is just remarkable.
Well,
I have
they're spoiled. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. I have no soft intro to this, but the last team, because we're coming up, we said we are going to talk about an hour. I think we're coming up close to that, Chris. So I want to talk this last team, then I'm going to give you a chance to plug your class. I didn't know about the upcoming book, so I either haven't been paying attention or this is new news. Either way, I'm excited. But I did want to get a chance to talk the Rockets. I wrote an article about them today. I'm probably going to write about them some more. They are just somewhat baffling to me to watch. And I'd actually just like you, Chris Ye, your take as a fan or whatever on them, because this is such a baffling team that I just don't understand at this point.
Well, first of all, let me again mention Dwight Howard is an idiot. And the way you can tell he's an idiot is, besides everything else, Dwight Howard was made to be a pick and roll dive man. That is the perfect fit for his strengths. He should be a super Tyson Chandler. He should be like the Tyson Chandler 3.0 version.
I'm going to use that. Brian, make sure I remember that for the show notes. Tyson Chandler 3.0. Okay, keep going.
And instead, Dwight Howard insists on getting the ball in the block and using that same ugly move that he's been using since he was a teenager. Because he's convinced that as a center, he should be a great post scorer as opposed to accepting what he is, which is astonishing to me. He was playing with Steve Nash, the greatest pick and roll player of all time, pretty much. You can debate him or John Stockton or whatever.
Okay, I was going to say you have to say Stockton if you're going to say pick and roll.
Stockton was working with Karl Malone that entire time, who was pretty much, again, a perfect role man. Nash had to get it done with people like, I can't even remember who, Stoudemire post-surgery, the year that Stoudemire wasn't there, he's running this with like Boris Diaw. I mean, come on. The guy was able to find baskets for role men under any circumstances. And Dwight Howard ought to just set the screen, go straight to the basket, and dunk about 10 times a game. But he doesn't because he's an idiot. All right. End of slamming of Dwight Howard. So the Rockets, I think, to take it to the alliance level, are a classic example of what happens when you don't put enough emphasis on the relationship, when you just have a team that's essentially a team of free agents. And I think everything that you talked about with James Harden and Dwight Howard sort of sniping at each other, trying to get one or the other out, reflects the fact that it's a team of people who are ultimately there as free agents and believe that they're there as mercenaries. And this comes from the top. I blame Daryl Morey. So and you may say, why do you blame Daryl Morey? What's wrong with Daryl Morey? I blame Daryl Morey for saying, you know what, I'm just going to continue to roll the dice. I'm going to continue to gather assets. I'm going to continue to make moves because those moves apparently pay off. But the fact is, there is a value to continuity. There are not a lot of NBA teams which made a bunch of trades and then won the championship the following year. I think the only example we can have for that are the Big Three Celtics, who again stole their name from the original Big Three Celtics. Right, you've got
that's a rough combo because I mean they didn't last as long, but if you just look at single season greatness, I think the 2008 Celtics, this is rough. I think the 2008 Celtics are probably the best Celtics team in Celtics history.
I will leave you to argue that with the Celtics fans. Not being a Celtics fan, I refuse to answer that question. But
fair enough.
It is the case that they essentially assembled that team overnight, and it won the championship. And that was the one exception to the great teams take continuity. Tim Duncan didn't win a championship in his first year. Magic Johnson, he came to a team that was already pretty stacked, and he put it over the top. But for the most part, you just can't assemble a team on the fly. And basketball is a team game. You need to get used to playing with each other. You need to build relationships. You need to have the kind of relationships that the Spurs have or that the Warriors have in order to win. And the Rockets, in their continued tinkering with the lineup and their continued tinkering with their situation, because Daryl Morey can't resist trades where he is able to, in his mind, pick up an asset, he's tinkered the team into oblivion practically.
Well, what's also sad, just from an analytics perspective, and is kind of just making me depressed because he is kind of the poster boy for analytics, is watching a lot of these trades that he's making. Either he's bad at analytics or he uses poor analytics because Corey Brewer, Josh Smith.
What the hell?
Yeah, that's the right answer. And then Michael Beasley now. So as soon as he picked up Michael Beasley, I just kind of went, "Oh, you don't know what you're doing." But then to your point, it's a compounded thing, which is, if he had just picked up James Harden and Dwight Howard and had a decent core around them and said, let's keep this team going, that might be somewhere. But he keeps tinkering, and then it compounds matters worse because he doesn't know what he's doing. That, by the way, is I don't think you mentioned it much in the Alliance, but just a classic problem of micromanaging bosses. They don't know what they're doing, but they keep micromanaging, and that is a really good way to make your employees hate you.
He is mistaking effort for achievement. Again, you have Harden, you have Howard. Despite the fact that Harden is great, and despite the fact that Howard is an idiot, he's still a star player. He's no longer a superstar, but he's still solidly a star player. All his limitations put together. And you should be able to build a winning team around that if you just don't keep screwing it up.
Now, and what I'll say, like, the Lakers and Spurs are two great counterexamples of this, which is, in the NBA, you can either have the volatile team of stars, mercenaries, for a short period of time and accept this team is probably going to win, has a ceiling of 1 to 3 titles. The second three-peat Bulls are like the perfect example. You get 3 titles out of this team and then it implodes. Or you get the Spurs, which is like, okay, we're going to probably have spurts of 2 to 3 years where we're title worthy, and then we're going to drop and we're still going to be a playoff team, but then we're going to have to wait and kind of do the up and down. And so many teams, the Rockets included, like the boom bust cycle, whereas the Spurs are like, great, little worse, great, little worse. And
by the way, quick plug for Boxscore Geeks and the Wages. When we repeatedly analyze this and shown that this notion of, you have to get bad to get good is idiocy. Absolutely. The Spurs have not had to get bad in order to get good. In fact, it's easier to get good when you're already good.
That's 100% true. And there's some just kind of myths in the NBA that I've just grown tired of. And yeah, that the fact that, like, the Lakers, it is true that top 3 pick is marginally better than not. But that's a better thing to have. And what I've been arguing all year is that they're costing themselves because they're, ticking off their rookies and possibly losing fans and all this other stuff. And I just wish people would interpret it as, yes, a draft pick is good, but you are way overvaluing it. That's all I got. All right. So anyway, Chris, we've talked for about an hour. I want it the last end of the show. Let's do 2 things. You said a new book is coming out. Hate to put you on the spot. What details can you give us on that?
Yeah, so quick plug for the new book. So the new book, it's not due out until 2017, so this is very early. But it's going to be a book on blitz scaling with Reid Hoffman. And that is the subject of the podcast, the Blitz Scaling podcast from Greylock Partners, that I believe is going to be in the show notes. And that is the Stanford class that we taught last quarter, where we had guests on like Eric Schmidt, your former boss, Brian Chesky, the founder of Airbnb, Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, Reed Hastings, the founder and CEO of Netflix, Diane Green, the founder and CEO of VMware, and so on and so forth. I'm not even bothering to mention people like Marissa Mayer, the CEO of Yahoo.
That is absurd. By the way, I'm looking this up just for anybody on the show. If you don't have time to look at the show notes, it's going to be Gray Matter. That's all one word, Gray with an E, and that's by Greylock Partners. If you do a search for that on iTunes, you can find that podcast. As Chris, you didn't mention this, but your Blitz scaling course is the only content there, but there might be more coming. For noobs like myself that haven't binge listened to all this yet, what is Blitz scaling? Just quick elevator pitch, and then we'll keep going.
Quick elevator pitch. So what blitz scaling is it's the incredibly rapid growth that companies in Silicon Valley use to achieve scale and some sort of lasting advantage. So from our perspective, it's not just growth for the sake of growth. It's a technique that you apply when reaching a certain critical mass or size allows you to achieve a lasting advantage in the marketplace. So a great example of this would be a marketplace business like Airbnb. where rapidly growing creates a dominant position thanks to the network effects. But there are other things where this might apply. Maybe it's you're building a consumer brand, or maybe you're locking in long-term contracts with your customers. But either way, when there's a big enough opportunity and when achieving scale confers enough advantage, you should be willing to spend money and resources in what seems like an inefficient way in order to grow as rapidly as possible into that opportunity. But if you do that, if you are in fact blitzscaling, what you then have to do is to do the subsequent thing, which is to realize you're going to have to break and remake your organization repeatedly. You're going to have to bring in new people who have the experience and the ability to manage that kind of growth. You have to understand that things are going to be operating in an uncomfortable and high-stress way. But if the opportunity is big enough, it may be worth it.
Oh, absolutely. And that does, I mean, Google was an example of that where, getting the entire internet on file and easily searchable at the cost of, contracts to places like AOL, et cetera, that seemed, less good than other companies were willing to do at the time, and foregoing things like ad-driven things was huge for that. I could talk.
Exactly. And that is one of the examples I often cite. Google signed a deal with AOL to handle their search results and to do the monetization of those search results. And the deal was AOL got 85% of the money and Google got 15%. And Google guaranteed $150 million a year in revenue to AOL under that contract. At the time, Google's total revenues were something like $20 million a year, and they had $15 million of cash in the bank. So they made an aggressive bet the company move in a deal that ended up being enormously lucrative and catapulted them to leadership.
Oh, absolutely. And so there's more like that. Yeah, I'm really excited to listen to this. This is one thing I love about, the internet and all this. I can get a Stanford class on iTunes now, which, used to be
for free.
For free. And I mean, that's impressive. As accolades for you, you are a New York Times. In 1 year, you have gone from being a very successful professional to being a more successful professional with New York Times best-selling book under your belt and Stanford professor. What's the official term? I'm assuming they don't just hand out professor.
Yes, it's officially guest lecturer. They are very clear that we're not to be called professors. Apparently, that makes the real professors mad.
I'm trying to remember. There was a guy that did a documentary on Apple, I seem to recall, and he was a teacher's assistant at Stanford or somewhere. And I think he did that when he was talking about it. He used the incorrect term, and so people were calling him a Stanford professor. And he had to come in and correct and say, no, I was a teacher's assistant there for
Be very clear, I'm a guest lecturer. That's very different than being a professor. But yes, it's still a big thrill for me to be affiliated with Stanford. I even have a little Stanford ID card with my picture on it, and it says staff, and it's very cool.
That is awesome. All right. Anything else you want to plug or say before the end of the show? Because this has been fantastic. One thing I'll give to any NBA teams listening, you should, if you're in the LA area, not LA, San Francisco area, try and contact Chris, sit down for 20, 30 minutes. I'm sure, Chris, you'll give him a good rate for your time, and just ask him about making your NBA team better, because so many of you could use this.
I actually know people at the Warriors, so I should probably try to get in front of them. So one last basketball related thing, just because I had put this in my mind and I'm curious what you think of it. So the Lakers and the Alliance. What's interesting about the Lakers is their history reveals that they have a tendency to prefer almost foundational approaches to their personnel. So they'll have Magic Johnson for his entire career, or they'll have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar for over a decade. They'll have James Worthy for his entire career. They'll have Kobe for his entire career. They seem to prefer these longer-term relationships with their players. And you can even see that in the fact that they bring people like Byron Scott back to coach the team. So they are truly a family-run business. It's the Buss family that owns it. When Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV, Jerry Buss actually insisted on signing an additional contract with Magic just to make sure he had enough money. So this was a very unusual way to run a team. But they combined that with a very sort of hard-nosed approach to the role players on the team, right? Their rotational tours of duty are very different than their foundational tours of duty. If you're Carlos Boozer or Ed Davis or Jordan Hill and you come on board, you're not one of the stars. Guess what? You're treated differently. Right? Kobe is treated differently than the rest of the players. Shaq was treated differently. Magic and Kareem were treated differently. And so it's an interesting case of they've been super successful over all this time, despite the fact that they took an approach which really is sort of a caste system, which I find fascinating.
It's, I think, a large part. So yeah, it's a lot to unravel there. We could go for another hour, but I think a large part of what has existed is there's been a huge allure about the Lakers, about playing for the Lakers, about playing for a title. I mean, remember in 2004, which I think, I'll have to remember this article, Brian. Chris wrote a fantastic article on the 2004 Lakers and why they weren't a failure and why this myth of the chemistry and whatever,
Right.
basically, okay, you've said this to me before, and as a non-Laker fan, I forgot who was the player that got injured that
Karl
cost them the
Malone.
final.
Karl
Karl
Malone.
Malone.
Karl Malone was injured. The Lakers were off to I think they were 20-5 when Karl Malone got injured. They were making noises about trying to win 70 games. Karl Malone got injured, and again, this is a Laker team that when Karl Malone got injured, their power forward players were Luke Walton and Slava Medvedenko.
Not, they're NBA players. They have played an NBA game.
That is technically true. Look, I'm a big fan of Luke Walton. Luke Walton is a surprisingly good player, but he's 6'8". He's not a power forward, and he shouldn't have been playing power forward. That was only out of desperation. Anyways, the Lakers somehow managed their usual 50-plus wins, got into the NBA Finals, were storming their way through the playoffs, and then Karl Malone injured his knee again. And so now you have the Lakers going up against the Detroit Pistons with Rasheed Wallace and Ben Wallace and all these different players, and you have, meanwhile, Slava Medvedenko making up a fifth of the starting lineup.
Jeez. So anyway, on that, that
And
players
by
have
the
been.
way, the Lakers should have won in '89 as well. Byron Scott and Magic Johnson went down. You can't win an NBA championship when you don't have your starting backcourt.
Oh, and then also even Michael Jordan's first one, right? Like James Worthy and Michael Jordan, or not Michael Jordan, and Magic Johnson both had injuries. It's a mess. Oh,
Well, that one, I'm willing to say, look, the Bulls were the best team in the regular season that year. They probably should have won that championship.
fair enough. But okay, so anyway, players have been willing to take a discount to play on the Lakers. So with this caste system, that's what's interesting is what you were saying is, they have a caste system, foundational versus rotational. And I think a big problem, this is just funny because it relates to what you're saying. The job market's changed. And with that's become a big problem, which is that caste system used to have intrinsic value. You get to play for the Lakers. You get to play for a contender. A lot of changes to the CBA, a lot of changes to the salary cap, a lot of changes to, the number of title teams, the teams that are marquee teams out there have changed. And as a result, that doesn't have the same value. And I think the Lakers are going to have to either realize the value, pay better or whatever, or change that system, or it's going to hurt them. At the same note, we were talking like the very volatile boom bust. If the Lakers can still get an influx of players that still really want to play in the stars, I was telling you I told you before the show, I don't recall if it was already on air, a few bounces go the right way, I actually think the Lakers could contend next season, which as a Nuggets fan infuriates me.
Yeah. And by the way, the allure of Los Angeles should not be underestimated. So I'll give you a couple of random examples for non-economic benefits that Lakers players get.
The traffic.
So
sorry, I had to throw that out there.
Had to throw that, but okay. You may recall that for quite a number of years, Sasha Vujacic, not again an NBA player,
He was good. No, he was a good shooter. The machine, yeah, he had a good three-point shot, right?
Good shooter, good three-point shooter. For many years, he was engaged to tennis star Maria Sharapova, the world's most highly compensated female athlete. She eventually broke it off, perhaps because she realized she was engaged to Sasha Vujacic.
Sorry.
But you don't get that. You don't have that kind of opportunity if you're playing on the Oklahoma City Thunder. Marko Jaric of the Clippers, second-round pick, Serbian guy, was traded eventually, I think, to the Timberwolves. Marko Jaric, while he played for the Clippers, dated supermodel Adriana Lima. I remember there was one game which the Lakers played where Luke Walton, they were doing an interview, and Luke Walton was in the locker room afterwards, and somebody was saying, "Oh, did you hear Britney Spears said she wanted to go on a date with you?" He was like, "Oh, really?" This was in the days when people wanted to go on a date with Britney Spears. So the point is, if you're a Laker, even if you're not a starter, the benefits, the side benefits that accrue are quite astonishing. And as long as NBA basketball continues to be primarily played by young heterosexual men, LA will continue to have an advantage.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't disagree. And I was thinking the Clippers might be able to come in and kind of snake that advantage, but with how Doc Rivers is running it, it just takes one or two seasons out of the Lakers and everything goes back to normal. And this era of Kobe's retirement run of 3 seasons is just a bad dream. And
Again, I'm just waiting for the various reports to come out. D'Angelo Russell romantically linked to, you name it, Jennifer Lawrence or something like that, right? This is what happens when you're a Laker. Don't forget that, poor Matt Kemp. Matt Kemp played for the Dodgers, huge star, starts dating Rihanna, then gets traded to the Padres. Haven't heard much about that since then.
and that's same state. That's sad. Well, California is a rather big state though. So anyway.
There's a huge difference between LA and San Diego. Sorry, San Diego. You stay classy.
How's it going there, Brian?
I don't live in either of those cities.
All right. I thought you said you were a lifelong Charger in it. Anyway, but all right, that is all I've got. That has been our show. Thank you so much for being on, Chris. I'm going to leave shout outs at the door and just say Brian, our producer, and Chris for being on. That's going to be our shout outs. Anyway, this is the Boxscore Geeks show. Our special guest has been Chris Ye. You can follow on Twitter at Chris Ye, perfect Twitter handle. Do you have a website, by the way, that you prefer people to find you on, or just look for you on LinkedIn?
Just going to the Twitter handle is fine. I think I have a variety of other places where you can find me, but just go to the Twitter handle. Almost everything will be centralized there.
And then if you want to find the great podcast that has you on it, Blitz Scaling, you can look for Gray Matter on iTunes. We'll make sure to have a link in the show notes. Anyway, speaking of links to ourselves, we are boxscoregeeks.com. You can find us on iTunes and Stitcher as The Boxscore Geeks Show. We go live. Depends on the time. Obviously, this week we went live on Monday, but follow myself, Nerd Numbers, Patrick Minton, NBA Geek, or our producer, Boxscore Brian, on Twitter to find out when we go live. And if you miss us live at twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers, you can catch the recap on YouTube channel Nerd Numbers. And finally, if you see a good box score for the week, something like, Klay Thompson and Steph Curry, shooting 1 for 18 combined, tweet at #BSG Top 10, and that might make my list of top 10 box scores of the week. Chris, spoiler alert, both those players will be on this week's list. I think I'm going to put them together. But anyway, thanks so much.
I think that's a perfect combo.
Anyway, that's been our show. Thanks so much, and we will see you next week.